Hello and welcome to episode 31 of Sarastro's Marvel Crisis Protocol painting series. In this video I'll be painting Sandman along with his two sand constructs from the Marvel Crisis Protocol miniatures game by Atomic Mass Games. I'll start by painting the face, where I'll be aiming for quite a dramatic sense of light and shade. Working outwards, I'll then be painting the green top, whilst it's still okay for me to lean on the other parts of the figure, and I'll also be adding a touch of green cast to the face. We can then go ahead and paint all of the sandy areas where I'll be blocking in the volumes whilst also bringing out the texture. We'll then finish the figures off by painting the various bits of debris, and I might even add one or two extra pieces into the mix. As usual, you'll find chapter links to the various painting stages to help navigate the video. Let's begin. Assembly of the miniatures was nice and straightforward. I did notice some quite visible joints however, especially for this construct, which you can see here. So I decided to apply some dark earth basing paste by Vallejo to obscure the lines. This will of course leave a bit more of a textured finish, which I'm okay with given that this is a construct made of sand. I've then primed the figures in black off camera, followed with some grey and white zenithal highlights applied from above as usual. And we're now ready to paint. When painting faces, I typically like to start with the eyes using an off-white. We can then draw on the pupils in black with a stroke that divides each eye, usually aimed just off-centre towards the nose. We can also then use this to carefully paint around the eyes, trimming the whites back if needed. Here I'm just mixing a little vanilla white into a pale grey to create a slightly warm tone for the teeth. And here I've gone a touch brighter. Regular viewers will know how much I enjoy using the Scalecolor artist paints when working with skin tones. Here I'll be using a mix of pink flesh and burnt sienna umber for my shadow tone, followed with a mid-tone mix of pink flesh and golden flesh, and then some vanilla white for the highlights. The red and Prussian blue are there for me to provide a little tonal variation once the main colours are in place. So this is my base tone mix of pink flesh and burnt sienna umber. We can leave a nice bit of black lining around the eyes to help with the definition. I'm now creating my main mid-tone using a mix of pink flesh and golden flesh, which I'm using to lighten the base tone in a couple of stages. We can then use this to place all of the broad areas of highlight, leaving just the deeper shadows untouched, before increasing the levels for the more prominent areas of highlight. Because of the slight tilt of the head, I'd like to keep the left side of the face more shadowed. Here I've added some additional burnt sienna umber to the base tone to reinforce one or two of the shadows. I'm now incorporating a touch of red for the lower lip. And this can be highlighted with the addition of some vanilla white. Once we've taken the skin highlights up to the pure mix of pink flesh and golden flesh, we can add some vanilla white to push the levels of the brightest points a little further. I'd now like to create some tonal interest by firstly glazing a little Prussian Blue into the chin area. You can see how thinly I'm applying this, and I've also unloaded the brush on my hand so as not to flood the surface of the figure. I'm just looking for a nice subtle tint here, and we can build this up in a couple of layers if need be. I'm also introducing a touch of red for the cheek and nose area, once again keeping the paint really thin and applying it sparingly. And here I'm applying a second thin layer of the blue. This is actually pretty easy to do, but really helps to add life to the face. Finally, I'm drawing on the eyebrows using the burnt Sienna Umber. This takes a steady hand, and even then I'd be prepared to make some corrections with the surrounding skin tone afterwards. Moving on to the hair, I'm starting with a base tone mix of brown leather and black. I'm then lightening this with some Iroko for the highlights. The ridges here are pretty well defined, so I'm mainly using the side of the brush to more easily pick out the texture. Here I'm being a little more careful and deliberate for the brighter highlights. Next I'm painting the green top. For the shadow tone I'm using a mix of black forest green and Ardennes green to achieve my desired level of saturation. I might also add a little black to this for the deepest shadows. For the midtones I'll be adding some Irati Green, followed with some spring green for the highlights. So here I'm mixing my shadow tones. And then adding the Irati Green and spring green to create my gradient. My approach here is to first ignore the individual stripes and simply block in the main volumes for the whole torso. You can see the zenithal highlights have quite cleanly mapped out the pattern of light and shade for us, so I'm more or less painting by numbers here. We can block the light and shade in using a couple of layers to achieve a nice solid finish. I'm now building up the values for the brighter areas, namely the upper chest and shoulders. And then basically refining some of the transitions, neatening up the neckline, and adding some more precise strokes of both shadow and highlight. Here I'm using pure spring green for some of these ridges. I've now added additional black to the shadow tone, and I'm carefully adding the dark lining into the grooves. I also wanted to add some dark lining to the neckline, followed with some cleaning up afterwards. With the top complete, I decided to glaze a little green cast onto the face. This is just to show light bouncing up from the green top, landing in some of the shadows, such as beneath the cheekbones, jawline, and the chin. We can also mix some green into the skin tones to add some more controlled touches of cast, such as here in the shadowed area above the eyes. Naturally, I put the most time and energy into painting the face and surrounding area, as it's such an important focal point. We can now be a little more fast and loose as we paint the rest of the figure. There are a wide range of browns and yellows you could use for the sand. I was inspired by one particular illustration, so had quite a specific colour gradient in mind, but you could use the same techniques with whatever palette you've chosen. For the shadow tone, I'm using an equal mix of Petroleum Gray and brown leather, creating a slightly purplish tint. For the midtones, I've chosen an equal mix of Arabic Shadow and Walnut, and I'm using a mix of Iroko and Thar Brown for the highlights. Notice how I'm controlling the levels of yellow by mixing in some less saturated brown tones. And I'll have a little Birch ready to pick out a few of the brightest highlights. So here I'm mixing each pair of colours to create my shadow, mid and highlight tones. I'm then loosely blocking in the shadows, followed by the midtones and highlights, and I'll be freely wet blending the colours as I go. I'm using a slightly larger, older brush here. I'm working with a little more care where the sand meets the torso, adding some small particles here and there, whilst keeping the paint nice and thick. And I'm painting the constructs in the same way. You can see I'm enjoying a nice bit of stippling here too. and here I'm using a medium-sized dry brush for both stippling and dry brushing to sharpen up the texture. I'm now adding some birch to my highlight tone to pick out some of my brightest points. I also decided to use the sandy tones for the jagged part of the hand construct. I'm now going to paint the various pieces of debris being swept up by the sand, starting with the ironwork where I'm using a bluish grayscale. For that, I'm simply mixing black, white and Prussian blue. I'm starting with a bluish off black, and I'm using this for the lamppost as well as the metal rods. I'm applying the paint somewhat thinned here. I'm then simply adding some white to build up the highlights, and I'm being pretty rough and sketchy in my application. For these panes of glass, I played around with some sketchy reflections, using a greater saturation of blue for the midtones. I'm now painting the breeze blocks and other pieces of stone using the more matte line of paints, mainly graphite darkened with black for the shadows and brightened with some Nacar for the highlights. For the traffic lights, I'm starting with a base tone of yellow ochre, followed with some highlights of Naples Yellow, Intense Yellow and Vanilla White. So here's the yellow ochre base tone. I'm now building up to some Naples Yellow highlights. This is quite a useful colour because although it's not especially vibrant, it is pretty opaque, so good for building up the levels. Next I'm adding a few bright highlights using Vanilla White. I'm then brushing over some thinned Intense Yellow to bring up the saturation. Here I decided to repeat the highlight and glaze approach for the top of each little half cylinder. For the little bricks, I started with a mix of Kalahari Orange and orange leather. I then added some pink flesh, followed with a little white sands to add some tonal variation and some highlights. I also decided to add a few additional pieces of debris, and you could use whatever spare basing bits you might have for this. Here I'm adding a printed out newspaper, partly because I was keen to introduce one or two touches of green to help balance out the figure. And this is the bottom half of one of the cups that comes on the sprue for the bases. Finally, I decided to glaze a subtle hint of green, orange and red over each of the lights. And I'm now using a light grey to add a few specular highlights. And this completes Sandman. Thank you for joining me. I do hope you've enjoyed the episode. As usual, you can find full paint and product lists in the video description, along with links to all of the places I can be found online, including Patreon, Instagram, Facebook, and Spotify if you enjoy the music. As always, my sincerest thanks go to my amazing patrons for funding this work and helping me to keep going. If you'd like to help support what I do, hit the Patreon link and pledge what you can. Join me again soon as we continue painting miniatures from Marvel Crisis Protocol. Happy painting!